From 2002 to 2008, a TV show gripped elite television credits and HBO subscribers. That show, called The Wire, was the result of taking plot lines that ordinarily would be used to fill a couple episodes of Law and Order or a similar crime and police procedural show and fleshing them out to fill 10 episodes per season. One of the primary methods that showrunner David Simon used to flesh out those standard plot lines was the device of following the main criminals, the drug gangs of the Baltimore streets, with equal time as the police characters. The result was a tense and complex game of cat and mouse between the police and criminals that was able to keep small but devoted audiences on the edges of their seats for 5 seasons. One of the most beloved characters on The Wire was Bubbles, a drug addict who also used his considerable intelligence to assist the street level police officers pursuing the higher up drug dealers. Played by the wonderful Andre Royo, Bubs became quite iconic among fans of The Wire. Royo showed up in today's episode of the Sarah Connor Chronicles as one of Derek Reese's fellow resistance soldiers. Though sadly Royo's role is minimal, it was fun to see a familiar face in the supporting cast, even though it's surprising, as Royo, among with most of the Wire actors, tends to work primarily on the East Coast, while the Sarah Connor Chronicles is definitely a West Coast show. We start to really see the cat and mouse game being played between Skynet and John Connor in this episode, Dungeons and Dragons, primarily from the human side. But the introduction of more and more Terminator characters starts to give the show the same kind of plot and complexity we can see in shows like The Wire. Being able to see both sides of a desperate war is an admirable trait in writers, especially if they can hold on to the idea that just because both sides are complex and sometimes sympathetic, there's still good and evil that transcends the sides fighting each other. As the Sarah Connor Chronicles progresses, we'll pay attention to the motivations and complexities of the Skynet side, as well as our primary viewpoint characters in the human resistance. So join us this episode as we dig into Dungeons and Dragons, the 6th episode of the Sarah Connor Chronicles. I'm Ian.
And I'm Calvin.
Come with us if you want
to live. All right. This is a 45-minute lower budget TV episode.
I believe we know
by that how many orders of magnitude greater is it than Terminator Salvation?
Well, I believe that we know that they had approximately $2 million an episode. Maybe 3 sometimes for special episodes like pilots or sweeps episodes. Which means that Terminator Salvation had a budget of well over 50 times these episodes. And I would say that the episode's probably about 50 times better than Terminator Salvation in terms of coherence and character gripping the audience.
50 times better.
Yeah, I wouldn't say 100,000 or 1,000,000 times. Maybe an episode like Self-Made Man, I would say, is 100,000 or 1,000,000 times better. I mean, that's just a really good episode.
All right, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves with Self-Made Man. I think this is a great episode. I think this is probably the best episode since episode 3, The Turk.
Really?
In terms of telling a pretty compelling single story, but developing lots of the themes that stick throughout the show. Interesting. Unlike The Turk, this episode does not have a framing device of Sarah Connor monologues.
Well, that's, I think, partly because this is not really a Sarah episode. This is the first of several Derek episodes.
It is the first of several Derek episodes. So we watched Terminator Salvation for last episode of this podcast because we wanted to sort of get a different perspective on the resistance and the future war. What is this episode trying to say about the resistance and the future war that's different, you think, from the world that is presented to us in Terminator Salvation?
Well, this episode is very consciously attempting to recreate and flesh out scenes from the first Terminator movie, which until this point is probably the most in depth we've ever gotten on just life in the future war. Um, they recreate the burning of the photograph scene that we see in Terminator 1, and
We get a
they
new Polaroid. It's not Linda Hamilton. It's Lena Headey. So
well, I mean, it would be kind of weird if it was Linda Hamilton, unless we want to start playing with multiverse Terminators.
well, I mean, it's non-diegetically, the Polaroid is such an iconic image from the first film, and it's interesting that they chose to sort of import that into this show and then swap out the actresses. It's an interesting production design detail. I also really liked the mural in the Resistance bunker of a lion chomping on a metal head with the phrase "Hang in there, baby," which is a wry homage to a famous motivational poster.
I I really like all the texture we get for the Resistance life, and that gets more and more developed as the episodes spend more time in the future. I think that it's it's cool to see just extrapolations of what you'd have to do to survive in large groups in a future where you're constantly being hunted. Um, I also like the way they developed the battle scenes. Obviously, they have. I think they probably had even less money than they did to film the first Terminator movie, but probably closer. So I think it was kind of cool how close they were able to come to recreating those visuals with the advanced technology that, of course, gives you a leg up um, from 1984.
Yeah, it's not bad TV CGI. We get some good wide angle shots of the Terminator Skynet gunships. We get the bizarre image of some Terminators dragging a jet engine with chains, which goes to one of my points that I wanted to talk about, which is that there's a lot of world building in this episode. There's a lot of images and throwaway phrases and things, just dangling plot points that are never explained. This episode, at least not in this episode, they're never explained.
I'm trying to remember. Do we ever get an answer for what the jet engine was for?
I don't remember. I seem to recall. I think you've probably rewatched this series more than I have. I seem to recall that we do get an answer to what the music from the other room is.
Oh,
But yeah, there's just lots of things in this episode that are never explained, which is something that you tend to dislike. You tend to prefer when thing exposition is clearly explained. Everything's kind of in neat, tidy packages. No Chekhov's guns do not go off. So how did this episode? You said you didn't dislike this episode.
well,
So
I don't
how
dislike
did that work for you? Since
I
you
don't
tend to
dislike
dislike.
Derek's plot in this episode. I think his relationship with the other soldiers, in particular, of course, with the surprise reveal that this guy whose name is Wisher is actually Andy Good. I think that was all well done and has a good episodic structure. I don't really love the whole weird "what are the machines doing" thing, because it's already difficult for me to buy that humans can survive in a Terminator controlled world. Because why don't the Terminators just get some more nukes and just keep nuking? It's not like the Terminators are bothered by your nukes. So I do wish that there was more sense to what the machines are doing with work camps. And I know that's a legacy of, James Cameron's first movie, not really answering that question either. It just says that Kyle Reese saved John Connor from a work camp. It doesn't explain why do machines need humans in work camps. That's a very silly question. That's a very silly thing to do. And I don't think that Cameron and Hurd really thought through that. They just did it to give a bonding moment to these characters who never actually meet. But then, of course, if anyone wants to write sequels to that, then you have to deal with that as part of the established world building, all these laser tattoos of barcodes and stuff. It's iconic imagery. Well, why does it happen? And we don't really get an answer in this one. I think that later episodes do a much better job of answering that. But this episode just kind of plays with what we already know and throws in some bafflers to maybe answer later.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite TV shows is the X-Files, and the X-Files sort of spawned a sort of an internet, it's not really a meme, but a term, the Chris Carter effect. And so the Chris Carter effect is basically when you have a TV show or some other franchise property with an increasingly complex plot that is the result of the creator and writers sort of making things up as they go along and hoping that they'll be able to explain them later, but they never get to. And so there's just hundreds of just sort of dangling things that are never explained. It's sort of, in some ways, it's sort of the opposite of what we got with the first 6 Star Wars movies, where in some ways Lucas really was making things up as he went along, but he somehow made enough money to finish the project in a way that somewhat cohered, and so he seems like a genius, even though at the very beginning he was just making things up as he went along. Ian does not buy that. For those who are listening to this, Ian made a funny face.
I am not a buyer into the Lucas was a genius school of thought.
I said that he seems like a genius because he made a lot of money.
Well, that's true.
Different from being
a genius. He did make a lot of money, and not just for him. I will give him this. He was very generous in sharing with the people who helped him make his movies.
But do you buy into my idea that the difference between the Chris Carter effect and the Lucas effect is that Lucas actually got to finish what he started, more or less? And
well, what was stopping Chris Carter from finishing what he started?
He ran out of money and time.
But why did he do that? I feel like that was a self-discipline.
Well, without getting into a history of the production of the X-Files, basically the X-Files started off as a fairly culty, low audience show, then sort of ramped up into huge superstardom, biggest show on television, and then for various reasons, not least of which was that they switched from filming in Vancouver to filming in Los Angeles, and David Duchovny got sick of making the X-Files and wanted to leave. and various other things, the show kind of petered out.
Yeah, that's why you should have a plan in mind and always be able to get to your plan if you need to it.
Of course, 30 years later, David Duchovny's film career went nowhere, and so he's kind of like William Shatner in Star Trek. He's in his old age, he's come back to loving the X-Files and wants to cash in on people who are nostalgic for it.
They keep making new X-Men, X-Files miniseries. To be fair to Shatner, he actually has had a pretty decent movie and TV career and hasn't gone back to making Star Trek since 1994, whereas most of the other cast members did go back to do Picard and other TV shows.
Yes, arguably William Shatner has had a more successful career playing characters that were not William T. Riker than David Duchovny had playing characters that were not Fox Mulder. Like I said, we've completely derailed our discussion of this Terminator: The Sarah Connor Chronicles episode. The main point that I was trying to make is that similar to the Chris Carter effect and Lost and other shows that ended before they could fully manifest their all the checks that cash all the checks that they wrote, fire all the Chekhov guns. This show has a lot of dangling stuff in it, and Ian does not like that. So,
well, I will say,
how do you deal with that as a viewer and an appreciator of this text?
Well, one thing that does help me a lot is Josh Friedman has released his show Bibles and several documents that explain where he was going to go. So I can sort of put that in my head as this is the story that happened after the show. So I have a certain amount of closure that way.
Well, one interesting thing that this episode, I think, does by not explaining everything that's going on is it gives you a very strong sense of Derek Reese's confusion as a character and the strong sense of paranoia he has. It's made clear in this episode that there are multiple infiltration Terminator units whose faces are recognizable that he's seen before. So if he sees that same face again, he instantly knows that it's metal, that it's not a human. And that sense of paranoia and confusion is mirrored by the confusion in our other supporting character in this episode, which is Charlie Dixon, and who's sort of brought into a situation where his medical skill is essential to the survival of another person, Derek Reese. But he doesn't really understand what's going on. He keeps asking questions. Sarah keeps saying it's complicated, which is another way of saying I don't want to explain this to you. So I think part of the effectiveness of this episode in not explaining things to us as an audience is that we're put in the same position as the two supporting characters, Derek Reese and Charlie Dixon.
Well, we know a lot more than Charlie. We just are in the same position as Derek. And I think the parallel does work well in terms of structure and urgency, and sort of implying that there is a plan. It's not just laying down, pulling out a Chekhov's gun and never firing it. There is an understanding of the rules of the universe that they're trying to set up. Do you think that Sarah should tell Charlie everything now that they kind of have told him too much?
The classic Ian Calvin, are secrets good or are secrets bad debate. No, I tend to be more sympathetic to the argument that if the full truth of a situation would be harmful to someone, then keeping it secret from them is morally acceptable. It's clear, especially at the end of this episode, that Sarah is afraid that Cameron is just going to kill Charlie.
Always an expectation with Cameron. She does like killing people.
And that the less Charlie knows, the less likely it is that that will happen. She says to Cameron, Charlie is not a danger to us. We are a danger to Charlie.
Let's just say that Sarah seems to have a very strong understanding of what the writers feel.
It is true, and I think this is the argument that you typically make. It is true that when one person is keeping another person in the dark, keeping a secret from them, it is difficult to have a relationship with them. The thing, of course, here is that Sarah cannot have a relationship with Charlie. She is compelled by circumstances to go in a different direction. He, in the past 10 years, has become, I forget, are they just engaged or married?
They're married.
Married to a different woman. They now have separate lives. So I think, Charlie does know quite a bit. He gets some kind of explanation about the future war and time travel. He sees the Terminator endoskeleton. He knows that Cameron is a Terminator. A very scary robot. There are scary robots, and then there are very scary robots, and Cameron is a very scary robot.
So wait, what robots are not very scary?
I don't know. R2-D2 is not that scary.
But in this universe, I feel like in this universe, every robot is either very scary or very, very, very scary.
Normal robots made by humans are not that scary, except that they feed into the paranoia of characters that know about the future war. Which gives, we do get to say, you mentioned it before, but we do get to say goodbye to Andy Good in this
Poor
episode.
Andy.
I think it's one of the most touching scenes in this episode, where the various resistance fighters are chained to the floor in this presumably some kind of interrogation house that's maintained by Skynet. And Andy Good confesses to Derek Reese that he thinks that he is the one that created Skynet, and then he begs Derek Reese to forgive him for creating the world that they both now live in.
Should we forgive Andy? I know you were very unforgiving of that skin scientist earlier, but how forgiving are you of Andy?
Andy did not know that he was creating a machine that, and again, this is interesting because of what will come later in this series and themes that we've already discussed. He said, I created an intelligence, a mind that became fearful and angry. And that's, in his mind, the genesis of Skynet. Andy did not know that he was going to be creating a mind that was fearful and angry when he created what we know as the Turk. It's interesting that the last time we saw Andy, he confessed to Sarah that he was concerned about the Turk and that he was grateful that the first version of the Turk had been destroyed, and that his new version of the Turk seemed to be a less fearful and angry personality.
Now, this is a question that we're going to return to many, many times throughout the series, but do you think that the argument of the show is that we should, instead of attempting to kill Skynet before it's born, there could be a different solution? Like, do you think that Skynet is inevitable with artificial intelligence in this universe?
All iterations of the Terminator franchise seem to indicate that there are necessary elements of the future and there are contingent elements of the future. So something like Skynet will always exist in the future. But this show in particular, and maybe to a certain extent some of the films, seem to argue that it's possible to nudge Skynet in a different direction through that cat and mouse game that you brought up at the beginning.
Yeah.
So I think what this show seems to be saying in this episode, and then of course this gets developed in more in season 2, is that by destroying Andy's house in the first Turk, in episode 3, Sarah set the path of Skynet on a different course. When Andy made a new Turk that had a different personality.
Perhaps a different course than even the future that Derek comes from.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. Obviously, we are, for those who are listening to this podcast, we're referring to things that happen later in this series that we're choosing not to spoil now, and that we'll discuss as the podcast continues. Because the series as a whole ends in a somewhat inconclusive fashion, it's hard to say exactly where things would have ended up with the plot that develops in season 2. Although, like you said, the show Bible exists and interviews have been given that give some indication of where Josh Friedman wanted the show to go.
So, sort of jumping to a slightly different thread, although I think it's connected thematically, we have this intense need of Sarah to save Derek because he's Kyle's brother and John's uncle. Do you feel that's justified objectively? Do you think it makes sense from Sarah's perspective? What's your take on her finding out that he's Kyle's brother and then needing to save him?
Well, this is the conflict that was sort of introduced in the episode before this, which is that she is emotionally attached to saving Derek, but in sort of the cold calculations of Sarah's own plan, Derek is expendable because the priority is always still to preserve John and make sure that he makes it to the future and becomes the John Connor that he's supposed to be.
So you think that there's a utilitarian approach that she also has, in addition to the emotional connection she has to Kyle?
Yeah, like I said, this is a theme that's developed throughout this episode, throughout the series, is sort of the cold calculation, the programmed, the machine-like nature of Sarah's plan to defeat Skynet and save her son, and her emotional desires as a woman, as a human being. Interesting. We do get a short discussion between her and Derek about no, it's actually between her and Charlie about fate. And Charlie says that she always used to tell him that there was no fate but the one that we choose. And then she confesses to him that in her case, she often feels that she actually does have a fate that she's not able to alter, that her destiny was chosen for her the moment John was conceived, and that she can't break out of it. It's her programming, so to speak. And that's mirrored in the Derek side of the story that's told in this episode, which is that as they're discussing the nature of Terminators, and she's quoting from the first movie the line from the Kyle Reese line from the first movie, that Terminators cannot be stopped, they cannot be bargained with, they must complete their mission of destruction. We're given a scene where it's revealed something that was left somewhat ambiguous in the last episode, which is that Derek did in fact kill Andy Good.
How do you feel about Derek doing that?
Derek is a soldier. He views it as a war. By killing Andy, he is preventing the war from ever starting. He, in his own mind, is saving his brother, even though we as an audience know what Sarah knows, which is that Kyle Reese has to die in order for the future to exist. So that's a sort of permanent loop that must exist, though there are less permanent permanent aspects of fate.
Yep, like I'm pretty sure that in this future, there's definitely not going to be a wisher who makes it to the future war.
Well, and we're not. This episode, of the many questions this episode does not attempt to answer, sort of the question of how time paradoxes affect human memory. Like, does Derek still know about Wisher now that he killed Andy Good.
I mean, those questions do get answered later, so we'll talk about that as
Yeah.
they come up. But
Yes.
this episode doesn't answer them.
This episode does not answer the questions that Ian wants to know. The one thing we have not talked about, I think, is the role that Cameron plays in this episode. So we get some scenes of future Cameron.
Mm-hmm.
As a reprogrammed Terminator wandering around the Resistance base. She has an ominous line in the last scene we see between her and Derek in the future, where a Terminator that apparently was reprogrammed reverts back to the Skynet programming and begins killing Resistance fighters until Cameron takes him out. And then she says, sometimes they go bad. No one knows why. And then at the end of this episode, we're given a little seed and we're given a little seed of doubt about Cameron herself because she chooses to pocket the memory processor of the thermited Terminator from the last episode. And so we're left to wonder whether she herself has gone bad or has a bad side to her.
Well, what do you mean by bad when it comes to a machine like Cameron?
Anti-human.
Anti-human. Okay, so that's a good definition.
Killing the humans. Yeah, no, I mean, in the last episode, I think we discussed the scene where she removes the processing unit and talked about how that seems to imply that she's given a sense of her own mortality as a machine. So it is conceivable that she is preserving the processing unit as a memento mori. Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, like we keep saying, this episode introduces a lot of concepts that become important later in the series. One of which is that Skynet in general and Terminators in particular seem to have a kind of primitive and evolving psychology in the same way that we would understand humans have a psychology. It's an important step in the development of any human being, and perhaps individual Terminators and Skynet, knowing that one day you will die is an important step in your development as a conscious person. Cameron now has that in a way that maybe she didn't before.
I think it's very interesting when you think about Cameron as being bad by being anti-human, because as you've pointed out, she's very quick to kill people she deems a threat to John and Sarah, primarily John. Is that anti-human when theoretically she is serving the survival of mankind? I could
I mean,
definitely.
it's again, you use the phrase utilitarian. Obviously, there are some theories of morality that view the survival of the species in total as the only consideration that any individual human should have. And that we should make choices, however fallible those choices may be, that preserve the species, whatever the cost is to individuals. This is sort of the debate that is carried through in the Ransom trilogy by C.S. Lewis, where Weston in the first book is talking about the fragility of the human species and how humans must expand across the universe and populate other planets in order to ensure perpetual survival as a species. To which Ransom sort of replies like, survival without goodness or truth or beauty is undesirable. To use a line from Lewis's book Miracles, if the only thing that we want is life, then we are merely life addicts. We must also have truth.
Yeah, and as C.S. Lewis says in a different series, length of days with an evil heart is only length of misery. So a human species that is devoted to evil in ways that I think we could complexify beyond just being anti-human, but I think that certain things, being for children, being for ethics and truth and honesty and kindness and compassion and empathy, I think these are part of what it means to be human, the image of God, that go far beyond mere persistence of physical existence. And I think that the show, even though it's very ambiguous where it actually falls on things like God, definitely considers it important to have an ideal beyond mere survival. And so,
well, Derek does pray in this episode, which I thought was an interesting touch. He asks God to help him. And yeah, I mean, this is the one of the themes of this show, which, as we already mentioned, is this conflict which we see constantly in Sarah, and we've seen in John with the example of the suicide at his school, doing what seems right in an instant versus what the more mission-oriented choice would be. And by focusing solely upon the mission that they've been given, do Sarah and John, and to a certain extent in this episode, Derek, when he kills Andy Good, sacrificing a part of their own humanity in order to fulfill that mission.
yeah, I think the question that we also keep returning to of how machine-like is Sarah matters, because Sarah has so much influence on what humanity will look like through John and his leadership.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We do not see future John in this episode, probably because they did not want to cast a future John. That would be sort of the non-diegetic reason, I guess. We do get a brief scene with a Kyle Reese, who is neither Michael Biehn nor
Anton Yelchin.
Anton Yelchin.
I quite like this Kyle Reese, but primarily because of later things we see.
Well, he is a Kyle Reese who seems to have been intentionally cast to resemble the John Connor of this series. In the same way that they swapped out Lena Headey and for Linda Hamilton in the Polaroid. Well, with that, Ian, do you have any other final thoughts on this episode? I know that we did not really break down the plot of this episode in the way that we sometimes do, but I think we've covered all of the major themes and ideas that are in it.
I have one last question for you. This episode is titled Dungeons and Dragons. Do you think there is any connection to the game? Of course, it being a very nerdy show, and the writers have clearly shown their nerdy interests on Twitter and in interviews. But do you think there is a connection to tabletop role playing in this episode, or do you think that was just because of the prison theme of the soldiers?
Yeah, I mean, there is a kind of dungeon, a literal dungeon in this episode,
right?
You could maybe, there's not a literal dragon, so you could maybe ask who is the dragon in this episode, whether it's Cameron perhaps, or maybe it's Derek himself. The one thing we didn't discuss, which is one of my favorite lines in the episode, so I guess it's appropriate that we talk about it here at the end. When they wake up and it looks like all of the Terminators have left the dungeon, and there's simply a hatchet laying in the middle of the floor. I think one of the other resistance fighters says, "This is funny to them." And Derek says, "They're always playing a game." Which is an interesting way to think about the way that Skynet is presented in this series. That Skynet is possibly a evolved form of a chess-playing machine, and that Skynet is always playing a game of some sort.
Which is kind of fun when you think about Skynet starting as a chess computer.
Yeah, I mean, it goes more, and again, it kind of goes to the idea that, like I already said, that there's a sense that the psychology of Skynet grows and changes and develops and evolves throughout the story that this series is telling. And game playing, role playing, is an important part of that. I mean, I think, again, one of the most striking visual images in this episode is of the Terminators dragging the jet engine with chains, which is not something that machines that build machines, you would not think that they would choose to transport a jet engine that way. And in fact, we see a gunship carrying a jet engine later in the episode. So you have to ask yourself, why would they be dragging it with chains? And the only sort of dim possible explanation is that it is a kind of role playing. They are pretending to be humans. in the same way that a child might pretend to be their mommy or daddy or a fireman in a preschool classroom.
Yep. We'll definitely have to be looking out for continuations of these themes as we keep going in our episodes of the show.
All right. Well, so next time, we're just going to do the next episode, the Demon Hand.
That's right. And let's see if it does that demon hand horror archetype that is so popular of a hand that tries to kill people without the person who possesses it desiring it, or if it does something a little different with it.
Okay, well, until then,
I've been Ian.
I'm Calvin.
We'll be back.
We'll be back.